Republic of Türkiye, and a presentation of the key findings of OECD Director for Trade and Agriculture, Ms. Marion Jansen. Mr. Corman and Ms. Jansen will be available for questions after their remarks. Journalists joining us on Zoom can also send in questions in the chat, and journalists here in the room will obviously be able to ask questions as well. For journalists joining us on the Zoom, please note that you have French interpretation available as well. With this, Mr. Corman, please.
Well, thank you very much, dear Minister Bolat, colleagues. Good morning, or good afternoon, I should say. The global race to secure critical minerals is reshaping trade, investment, and geopolitics. And this morning, the OECD gives governments the clearest picture yet of one of the most consequential and often overlooked forces driving that rise, and that is the whole topic of export restrictions. The data points to a trend that cannot be ignored. Export restrictions on critical raw materials are increasing, and they have risen for 15 consecutive years, and with a total number of restrictions now 5 times higher than they were back in 2009. And that is at a time when we have accelerating and rapidly growing demand for those critical raw materials. The fastest growing category, ores and minerals, has seen restrictions multiply tenfold. Around 70% of global exports of cobalt and manganese, essentially battery inputs, now face at least one export restriction, which is up from roughly 1/3 and 1/2, respectively, 15 years ago. And the most restrictive measures, that is outright prohibitions of exports or export quotas, are no longer rare. They now account for more than 1/3 of all new measures introduced in 2024, up from just 3% in 2017-2019, which is not that long ago, from 3% to more than 1/3. What the evidence tells us is that export restrictions distort investment, reduce export volumes, and ultimately undermine the very security of supply they're sometimes meant to protect. So I just cited again, at a time of rapidly increasing demand for critical raw materials, the policy settings as they have evolved over the last 15 years are leading to reduction in volumes available in global markets, ultimately undermining the very security of supply that they are meant to protect. They slow the adoption of clean and digital technologies, and while export restrictions are often justified as a tool to promote domestic processing and value-added activity, the evidence consistently shows their effectiveness in achieving that goal is highly, highly limited. So in terms of the path forward, the answer is not to accept that export restrictions are inevitable, but it is to build alternatives, and alternatives around keeping markets open. It means structured engagement between producing and consuming countries on shared policy objectives. It means diversifying supply through high-quality sustainable investment in new sources, and it means using the tools the OECD has developed to make that investment flow. Our guidance on blended finance provides best practices for leveraging public capital to de-risk and attract private investment, including in critical mineral projects. Our arrangement on officially supported export credits supports more favorable financing terms for those same projects. The Critical Minerals Forum we are holding here in Istanbul today exists precisely for this purpose: open, productive dialogue between countries that hold these resources and the countries that need them. The OECD will continue to provide the data, the analysis, and the practical tools policymakers need to help reduce bottlenecks, to advance diversification, and to build the supply chains that the global economy requires. The trends that you can see in the inventory that we are launching today are a warning. Our work together here and over the next several months and years will have to provide the response. And with that, I'm pleased to handing over the floor to Minister Bolat. Thank you.
Honorable Secretary General, Honorable Director General, and distinguished press corps, dear colleagues, it is a great pleasure to join you today. We are here for the launch of the OECD inventory of export restrictions on critical raw materials. Just a while ago, we had launched the OECD Critical Minerals Forum series, which had a very strong interest and participation by worldwide countries. Firstly, I should heartily thank the OECD Secretariat General for this very valuable and timely work. This inventory by OECD provides an essential evidence base. It helps us to understand a rapidly changing global landscape. It also improves transparency. It also supports better policymaking and international dialogue. Today, critical raw materials are no longer just commodities. They are strategic assets. They are essential for the energy transition. They are essential for the digital transformation. They are essential for advanced manufacturing. From semiconductors to renewable energy systems, from defense technologies to high-end industrial production. Entire value chains depend on secure access to critical materials. However, access to critical materials is becoming more uncertain. The OECD's findings clearly show this trend. Export restrictions on critical raw materials have increased fivefold since the year of 2009. They remain at historically high levels today. It is a structural shift. Between 2022 and 2024, around 16% of global critical raw materials trade was affected by export restrictions. For some minerals, the exposure is even higher. Around 70% of cobalt and manganese exports are affected. Nearly half of graphite exports are affected, and 45% of rare earth elements are affected. We also see a change in the type of measures. Export taxes and licensing requirements remain the most common tools, but more restrictive measures are increasing. These trends have serious implications. We are aware that export restrictions may serve domestic policy goals. However, they may generate revenue or support industrial development. But when widely used, these export restrictions also create negative spillovers. They tighten global supply, increase price volatility, and weaken supply chain resilience. In an already fragile global economy and global trade, this increases fragmentation risks. This is why cooperation is essential. We need open and predictable markets, diversified supply chains, and coordinated international action. The OECD's inventory on critical raw materials restrictions is more than a database. It is a public good. It strengthens transparency, supports evidence-based policy responses. As the Republic of Türkiye, we attach great importance to open, rules-based trade. We believe critical raw materials require balanced approach. We must protect legitimate national interests, but at the same time, we must also preserve global supply chain stability. Let me conclude by thanking very much to the OECD once again. This work, inventory work, strengthens our shared understanding and it supports collective solutions. Together, we can build a more secure, sustainable, and cooperative future. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Minister, and I invite Director Jansen to the podium and ask my colleagues to pull up the slides, please.
I'm waiting for the slides because my role is to repeat the numbers you already heard, but to put color behind it. There we go. It is my great pleasure to present here today, to release today the 2026 edition of the OECD Inventory of Export Restrictions on Critical Raw Materials. We have been collecting data on export restrictions on critical raw materials since 2011, because in the 2010-2011 period, already one of our members experienced and was the victim of the use of such export restrictions. You have heard... No? Yep. You have already heard the figure that export restrictions on critical raw materials have been increasing for 15 consecutive years. This is what you see on this picture here. Growth has been slowing, but nevertheless, between the previous year we collected 2023 and 2024, the increase in the use of export restrictions was of 0.6%. You have already heard that around 16% of trade in critical raw materials is covered now by at least one export restrictions, but for some raw materials like cobalt or manganese, that percentage reaches 70%. Here, one of the worrying developments reflected in color. On one side of the chart, you see the number of countries that have been the countries that have been most frequently using export restrictions over that period, 2009-2024, covered by the report. And on the right, those who most heavily introduced new restrictions in 2024. And the most striking part of that picture is that the four countries that you see on your right, Myanmar, Sierra Leone, Nigeria and Burundi, that are responsible for over half of the new export restrictions. So on the right side, the four countries responsible for over half of the new export restrictions, those countries don't even appear in the average for 2009-2024. They are in the other group that is orange here. What does that say? That the countries that are very active now and in recent years were not using export restrictions in the past. And that leads us to this finding that was already raised by Secretary General Corman, that export restrictions are being used by a wider range of countries. And that's what you see in the title of this chart. And this is worrying. Use of export restrictions becomes more common. The area, the type of critical raw materials where export restrictions have increased most during the period that we observed, 2009 to 2024, are the ores and minerals, so the type of products that are very relevant for the discussions here today. This is the area where we saw the biggest increase, so the longest bar. We put in green another bar, that's the bar of export restrictions on waste and scrap. The increase hasn't been highest there, but that's the materials where the use of export restrictions is widest spread, is most prominent. So not the growth, but the prevalence of export restrictions. And we heard this morning in the session organized by Business at OECD, for those of you who were there, that export restrictions in these areas, waste and scrap, are particularly bad when it comes to the recycling, to optimizing the recycling potential for critical raw materials. Last but not least, my final slide here, I draw your attention to the red line. As you heard, export taxes and licensing requirements are still, that's the green line, the type of measures that are most prominently used. That reflects notably that the objective of revenue generation is the fastest growing rationale behind export restrictions, and there, of course, taxes are a useful instrument for that particular objective. But the red line shows that the type of restrictions that has been increasing most rapidly is the use of the most severe type of export restrictions, those of outright export prohibitions. All these export restrictions are bad for international trade, they hamper international trade, are bad for investment, and are therefore bad for the type of increase of production in critical raw materials that we would require. I would like to invite you, therefore, to have a deeper look at the material in this report. You can download it from this site, and you find on the site OECD/CRMs also the other work the OECD does on critical raw materials, and notably the work we do on addressing the bottlenecks in the production and the trade of critical raw materials, and hopefully reducing the use of export restrictions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Marion. I would now like to open the floor to journalists for questions. Yes, please. If you can introduce yourself with name and medium, please.
Hello, gentlemen and madam. Thank you for hosting us here today. I would have two questions, and first of all, I'm Emre Başaran, Istanbul Bureau Chief of Euronews. I would have two questions for Mr. Secretary General. Could Turkey's production capacity and potential of rare minerals be seen as an insurance policy for energy security, especially for Western economies, because China is pretty dominant in the sector? And to the minister, Mr. Minister, China holds 70% of the global processing capacity for rare earth minerals, and Turkey possesses both rich reserves and a strategic geographical location. On this occasion, I would like to ask, are trade agreements with Central Asian, African, and European countries on your agenda? Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much. The first thing I would say is that Turkey, in its own right, but also because of the leadership role and the example it can be for other emerging markets and also for some developing market economies, is a very significant contribution that Turkey can make. Turkey has got vast amounts of untapped resources of critical raw materials, but Turkey is already highly successful in going up the value chain and in processing some key critical mineral products, which are hugely important for industrial production. And Turkey has the realistic ambition to continue to go up the value chain across a broader range of critical raw materials. And I think that Turkey's experience and Turkey's success can be something that many countries across emerging market and developing economies can copy, And as more countries copy Türkiye's initiative and its success, that will help boost the supply across the global economy, and it will, by definition, help to diversify sources of supply. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is an unambiguous yes.
Thank you for the question. As our dear Secretary General explained, Türkiye is very much open to international competition and trade in all products, manufacturing goods, services, and as well as minerals. And Türkiye, as we all have seen on the charts, which were shown to us by Ms. Marion Jansen, had no name on the charts for export restrictions. I showed it to Matthias Korman that Türkiye was not on the list for export restrictions on critical raw materials, because the Turkish economy is boosted by foreign trade, both imports and exports. We have totally $820 billion of goods and services trade in both exportation and importation, including minerals and including critical raw materials. Our exports of minerals to the world are worth $6.5 billion a year. And Türkiye has also untapped critical raw materials, as our Minister of Energy explained a while ago in the main plenary session. So we will try to keep supply chain open for the world stability, for the world growth. And as Türkiye, we have been diversifying our both raw materials inputs, energy needs. Also, we have been diversifying our production, manufacturing sector, and our exports. From Morocco to China, in the southern hemisphere, there are two countries which have integrated, diversified manufacturing sectors, China and Türkiye. Therefore, we need the stable trade routes, safe and stable trade routes. We need safe and stable supply chains for our needs of energy, products, and inputs and raw materials. We also need our goods and services to be exported to world markets safely and in a stable manner. So we keep international cooperation. We pay attention to increase international cooperation in all fields relating to international trade, either for manufacturing or for food or for services or for minerals, mines. Thank you.
Many thanks. We have time for one last question. If we don't have a question in the room, I will take the ones from the Zoom. 1 second. Sorry for this. Marion, this question is for you. We see in the data you shared which countries are implementing export restrictions, but what about importing countries? Who are most exposed to restrictions on critical raw materials?
We have...
Yes.
Yep. We have seen a number of our member countries very much investing in diversification and becoming less exposed. We have notably seen the family of European Union members and Japan reducing their exposure to export restrictions. But a country like Japan continues to have a higher exposure than the world average, and that's the case also for South Korea. So still too much exposure in some of our member countries, but efforts underway and observable efforts to reduce this.
Many thanks, Marion. This concludes our press launch. For the journalists joining us online and having submitted the questions by Zoom, we will reply in writing. Many thanks for your understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.